On behalf of the OOIDA Foundation, we would like to welcome you to this session of OOIDA's Business Education Series of online training. This series is the most comprehensive series of business education that has been designed exclusively for the professional truck driver. There are a lot of drivers who are really good at driving a truck, but struggle to make a living in the industry. With these presentations, we're trying to help the drivers who excel at operating a truck understand how to be a successful business person. This education series is intended to help drivers navigate the business side of the trucking industry by providing an accessible and relevant introduction to the management principles of operating a successful trucking business. We would also like to congratulate the thousands of attendees who have taken part in this series. Your overwhelming response has helped to ensure that these programs will continue into the future. Hello, and welcome to this session of OOIDA's online education programming. My name's Tom Gann, and I'll be your host for this series, which covers the drug and alcohol regulation as it applies to professional truckers. This regulation is obviously too complex to cover in one session, so we've decided to break it down into 4 programs, each approximately 30 minutes in length. In part 1 of this series, we cover who's responsible for what in the drug testing process. In part 2, we talk about the different types of tests and the chain of custody. In part 3, we identify the drugs that drivers are tested for, and we also discuss the ins and outs of alcohol testing. And in part 4, we talk about how the test results are reported, we talk about the return to duty process, and we talk about the consequences that drivers may face if they try to get out of or try to cheat the testing process. For this program, Part 3, I'm fortunate enough to have Steve Nickel join me again. Steve's a customer service agent with OOIDA's Drug Consortium, CMCI. You may have heard Steve speak before. He's been a frequent guest on Landline Now, which can be heard on Sirius XM's The Road Dog. And Steve has appeared on several of our OOIDA online education programs in the past. I like to kid Steve that everyone always wants him as a guest because he has that deep radio voice. I will say this, though. He's one of the few people around who can actually pronounce all the drug names. And that's going to come in pretty handy because in this program, we're going to be talking about what drivers are tested for when they get called in for a drug or alcohol test. We're also going to dispel some of the myths that you hear floating around the truck stops about drug tests. And Steve's also going to give us some warnings about alcohol test. There are some things that can cause you to have a positive alcohol test even though you're not drinking liquor. Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover and we don't have much time. 30 minutes is our limit, so we better get started. Steve, in part 2 of this series, we talked about what to expect when you go in for a drug or alcohol test. What to expect when you walk in the door. And the one thing we didn't talk about was the drugs that they're looking for when you go in. I know there's several different classes of drugs, so let's talk a little bit about that.
There are basically 5 types of drugs that they're going to look for if you go in for a random DOT drug test. But then also, if you go in for a drug and an alcohol test, they're going to be doing your alcohol test with you at the same time.
Do they ever call you in just for an alcohol only?
It can be. The regulation isn't that specific. It'll say that you can be selected for drug or selected for alcohol.
So a driver could get called for a drug test, he could get called for an alcohol test, or he even could get called for a drug and alcohol test. Okay. Now, one thing we did mention a little bit in the last program was prescription drugs. And what they were telling us was when you go in, if you're on a prescription and you may have a prescription for a forbidden drug, that you don't tell the doctors when you're having a drug test. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely, because they don't want to know. They want the laboratories to be the ones that find this stuff when they're going through and performing the test itself. The regulation itself forbids you notifying the collection facility of any medication you're on.
Let's be clear and let's don't scare everybody to death. If you're on a medication, you're going to test positive.
Oh, absolutely you can, but just remember, the thing is they're looking for illegal medications.
So when your test results return positive, the MRO is going to contact you and tell you that it's returned positive, and you're going to inform him that you have a prescription for whatever drug that you've tested positive for. And you're probably going to have to prove that you do in fact have that prescription. But once you satisfy the MRO that you legally have a prescription for that drug, your test will be returned as a negative.
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, they're only looking for misuse, abuse of this medication, not something you're supposed to be on.
Steve, in part 2 of this segment, we talked about the drug test itself, and all we talked about was urine samples. I know that there was some talk about using hair samples. Is that something that DOT is looking at, or is it possible that some states may go that way?
Well, in actuality, the DOT itself did bring it up a few years ago, but there was too much, I don't think you want to use the word inconsistency, but the variables were too high in it. A good example, they had discovered that gender, race, hair color, all affects on how long this stuff stays in the hair itself. And at that time, if you tested positive and you had to do another test, the confirmation test was a urine specimen. Well, if you're going to pee in a bottle, you might as well do it in the first place. Now, there has been word that they're investigating this again, but how far it's got, we have no idea.
How about, I watch CSI and all these programs on television, and they do a swab test. Is that something they're looking at?
Well, yeah, there has been talk of checking out a swab, which looks like a very logical thing because it's using the moisture in your mouth, just like they can do an alcohol swab. And the way they would come up with the split sample on the drug test is there's 2 swabs in a pack. So they snap them open. You're going to swab the inside of your mouth on both sides with them. They'll put them back in the pack. Now, when they send them to the testing laboratory, they've got, again, an A sample and a B sample. So if you decide that you want to have the split sample tested because they call you with a positive, now you've got a whole separate swab that they can send to another independent lab to be tested. The logic is there if they can get it to where it is consistent and they know it's consistent like they know the urine tests are.
But for the time being, urine test is the only thing that applies.
That's the only acceptable DOT test for drugs is a urine specimen.
Let's talk just a little bit about the drugs themselves. What are some of the drugs that you're going to be tested for?
Okay, Tom, there's a small misconception. Actually, people only are tested for 5 main types. But a few years ago, the DOT allowed some specific medications to be reported under their own name. That did not change that you're being tested for 5 medications. A good example is ecstasy. It falls under amphetamines. So yes, you're going to fail a test for amphetamines, but the actual test itself will show that it is either MA, MDA, or MDEA. It's one of those because that is the specific medication, but it's still, you're only being tested for 5 items. One of those is marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and PCP, which is phencyclidine. Now, they'll test for those and any other subcategories.
So there are 5 classifications of drugs they're going to look for. Some of those can be broke down into some subcategories.
Oh, exactly right. All they're doing is basically reporting it under its true name instead of just the main category of amphetamines.
Steve, let's talk just a little bit about the 5 classes of drugs that they're tested for. And the very first one you mentioned was marijuana. And I know marijuana has really been in the news, with a lot of states that have legalized it. Mm-hmm. It's becoming a much more social drug. And actually, I just ran into that situation. I went out to visit some family out in Colorado, and we all got together and kind of had a family picnic, and somebody had brought brownies. And it never crossed my mind, but my sister-in-law, the first thing she asked the person who brought them, and she said, "Do these have pot in them?" And, of course, it's legal there, and it's just part of the life that I would have never even considered asking. But if you're a truck driver, you better learn to ask these things.
Oh, absolutely, because if you don't know what's in something, how can you prevent it from being there? And ignorance is no excuse. When you test positive, you test positive. That's the end of it. Just because the state says marijuana is legal, the federal government says it's not. You test positive for marijuana, you're still going to fail your test. You're still going to go through the return to duty process. It doesn't matter what the state said was legal or not. Federal law overrides state law in this manner.
And that CDL is a federal license, isn't it?
Exactly right. Now, of course, it's like anything else. If you're driving your truck and they stop you and you've got a breath alcohol content of 0.04 or higher, now you've broken a federal regulation. Well, let's say you're driving your vehicle in a state and your state law says 0.02 is legal. You've broken a state law. That doesn't affect your CDL as far as the DOT is concerned because it wasn't a DOT test. The same thing is going to be with this. State laws don't matter where it comes to marijuana. It's the federal laws that matter. That's what you have to meet.
One of the other drugs you mentioned was opiates, and I've always heard rumors that you can eat certain foods that would cause you to test positive for opiates. Is that really true?
Well, again, you can't believe what you read on the internet, anymore, but some of your medications, good like the opiates, are made out of poppy seeds. And people wonder, okay, I'm going to eat poppy seed rolls. I'm going to have this thing with poppy seeds on it. I can't see how you could ingest enough of that stuff to make any kind of difference.
Or you'd have to really like poppy seeds, wouldn't you?
And it just, because I would really feel that not just in the DOT matter, but any that there would be some kind of a warning out there of some kind. Don't eat this many poppy seeds, it just, but no, I hear that, and I've heard it all the time from people over the years that I've been here. Well, I've been eating well, probably not. If it was, you probably wouldn't be able to buy it on your bun, but there's no documented proof that we can consider honest that says yes.
So it would be pretty hard to fail a test and convince your MRO that it was something you ate.
Oh, believe me. If he's a good MRO, you're not going to convince him of that.
Okay, we talk about opiates. We use the medical term, but a lot of people don't really understand that when we talk about opiates, we're talking about painkillers. It could be any kind of prescription, Tylenol 3 or any of those type things.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the reasons you ask your doctor anytime you get a medication, well, what is this? Because if it's a Schedule 2, 3, or 4, you want to get permission to drive with it. So you want to make sure you cover yourself.
Now, the other drug, which is kind of the opposite of opiates, is amphetamines. And those are, what we used to call speed or uppers. And that's also one of the drugs you're going to be tested for.
Oh, absolutely, because, used to a lot of this stuff was over the counter before it started being something the DOT checked for, because people wanted to drive as far as they could. They wanted to make sure they got it done, so they wanted to keep something that kept them from getting tired.
Yeah, and unfortunately, guys get paid by the mile. They don't get paid by the hour. And especially before the hours of service regulations, guys would do all kinds of things to where they could stay up and get that load delivered, whether they thought they were doing a favor for the shipper or they were trying to make more money, or if they were under pressure from the motor carrier. Whatever the case may be, they were doing all kinds of things. Today, they still do. There are two stimulants, one coffee and the other these energy drinks that people are taking. If I'm drinking a lot of Monster or whatever energy drink, is that going to cause me to test positive for amphetamines?
No, it won't cost you to test positive for that, because basically what they're using is excessive amounts of caffeine or sugar to stimulate your system.
And those are not illegal?
Those are not illegal.
Now, a few minutes ago, you mentioned cocaine, and I know that's one of the other drugs that you're tested for. And unfortunately, cocaine has become a popular social drug in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard the other day a driver called in. He got pulled for a drug test, and the first thing he said was, "Hey, I've used cocaine recently. Do I have to go take my test?" How do you answer that?
If you're the owner of the company and you're the one that selected him, yes, because he was selected. That's why it's called a random program, so that you can actually, by accident, find this stuff out. It's too easy for people to hide this stuff otherwise. So he still has to go, and if he says no, he's not going, now that's a refusal, which again is a failure of the test. So yes, once you've been selected, you have to go. That's with cocaine, opiates, marijuana, codeine, amphetamines, any of that. If you've got that in your system and you say no, that's a refusal.
So even a self-admission, you're not going to be driving?
No, because once you either fail or refuse, you're not allowed to do anything considered a safety-sensitive function.
Now, that fifth drug that they test for is PCP, and that I know is a Schedule I drug. And a lot of people don't understand the difference between Schedule 1, 2, 3, or 4. So can you explain that just a little
Schedule
bit?
1s, there are no legal medications made out of any Schedule 1 medication. Schedule 2, 3, and 4 are legal medications, and they are controlled. Those are the ones that if you have a prescription for them, a legal prescription, you can pass your drug test. But if you're going to drive, you should get a written document from the prescribing physician that says it's okay while to drive on them.
So if you're caught taking Schedule 1 drugs, you're not going to drive,
Well,
period.
it shouldn't be on any kind of a Schedule 1 because they're all illegal.
Schedule 2, 3, and 4, you take those, you get a prescription for them, you might be able to drive, but not
That's right.
necessarily.
That's the doctor's call. That's why they tell you to get a letter from him specifying you'll pass your test if you get selected. But that does not mean that the doctor is going to say it's safe for you to drive while on those medications.
So basically, everybody needs to understand poor judgment is not an excuse.
Oh, exactly right. In all of our lives, we've been raised up, and I know at my age, I heard it when I was a kid. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. It's your responsibility to know what you can and can't take. Let's kind of go the other direction with this, too. Just because you pass a drug test on a legal medication doesn't mean you can drive while you're on it. A medical physician of any Schedule 2, 3, or 4 drug should, in writing, tell you that he understands you drive professionally, and in his opinion, it will not affect your ability to drive. Passing a test and being able to drive on the medication are two separate sides of the ballgame.
So if I fail a drug test and the MRO calls me up and I say, wait a minute, I got a prescription, it's not good enough just to have a prescription. I also have to have a written statement from the doctor saying it's okay for me to drive.
Well, that's only for the employer's benefit. That way he can use you. What you're going to do is you'll pass your test. You don't even need to worry about the written. If you've got a legal prescription, that's fine. What the written documentation is to provide to your employer that the doctor says it's okay for me to drive while under this medication. If the employer says, no, I'm not going to allow you to drive while on that, and he's got it in his company policy, then he does not have to let you drive while on it, even though the doctor says it's okay.
So if you're a company driver or you're leased to a motor carrier, that would apply. Now, if you're running under your own authority, you're going to have to tell yourself it's okay to drive.
Yeah, still what you want to do is make sure that you get it in writing, because what if some kind of an accident happens? Now you've got documentation that you were told it is safe for me to drive while on this medicine. Is it going to get you off the hook for everything? No, but then you've proven you were told it was safe. But no, as an employer, I'd want to know what my people are on just to cover myself. And if I feel it's not safe, then it should be my call.
All right, now we've kind of touched on the 5 drugs you're tested for, but there's also the alcohol test. And let's talk a minute about that alcohol test. You know, you hardly ever hear of anyone flunking an alcohol test.
It's because actually if you do, it's your fault. Because legitimately, even if you're not talking about the drug and alcohol program, other parts of the DOT regs tell you can't drive or have alcohol in your system within so many hours of going on duty. All alcohol tests must be performed immediately before, during, or immediately after performing a safety-sensitive function. Now, what you have to watch is the ones you don't think about, because they're not talking about whiskey, bourbon, vodka, those kind of alcohol. You could be talking about mouthwash. They could be talking about Vicks Formula 44. They could be talking about any kind of prescription liquid medication, because in most cases, the alcohol is what's getting the medication into your system. You can't have that. The regulation says alcohol. All the test does is denote it's alcohol.
So if I'm going in for a alcohol test, I don't want to take any mouthwash right as I walk in so I don't have dragon breath.
Well, as I tell them, it's better to have dragon breath. Go on in, because remember, it's your livelihood you're messing with. They may get offended by your breath, but you're going to pass the test. And it's a whole lot better to do that than it is to fail one, because now you just jeopardized your ability to drive and earn an income.
Okay, when you're tested, do we have any idea how long marijuana stays in your system? How long would that show up?
Now, that's an oddity. The closest thing you've got to a guideline on that is when they talk about a post-accident test. With a post-accident test, if you're required to take a drug and alcohol test because of your accident, it says you must have the alcohol test done within 8 hours and the drug test done within 32 hours. That is the closest thing to any kind of a guideline that we have in the regulations on how long something stays in your system. A lot of this is left up to your metabolism. How fast does it go through? It's just like you and your brother may go out and drink one night and he's sober 3 hours later and you're not. His body metabolizes the same things faster than yours do. But it's the end product. What the test shows is what the test shows.
And you would think people whose very livelihood depends on being drug-free would be extra cautious. But unfortunately, sometimes people just get caught up in a bad situation.
Oh, they do, and it's very easy. You go into a room and, everybody's smoking cigarettes. That don't mean that's the only thing that's being smoked in there. You have to be cautious. You have to know your surroundings. The same thing as when you're driving the truck. You have to know what's going on around you, and you have to be observant. Anywhere you go when you're off-duty time or on-duty time, you have to know, because this could affect your livelihood due to a positive test. Never take medication that's not specifically prescribed for you or you personally have bought off the shelf. I know it's always polite, and for years everybody's done it. Oh, I'm in a truck stop and my head's just killing me and I don't have anything. Well, I got something to get rid of it. I mean, there's no problem there, and you go out and it's legal for him, ain't legal for you because it's not your medicine. And then you get popped for a test on Monday and now you failed. And in all reality, you're probably going to say, well, I don't take drugs. I don't know how this could have happened.
Steve, is there a cutoff value or a number that determines if you've had too much drugs? For instance, with alcohol, there's a measurement which is called your breath alcohol content. If your breath alcohol content is 0.04 or higher, you're considered impaired. Is there a value like that with drugs?
Everything has a cutoff value when they test it. And a good example of that is like marijuana. On its first test, when they send it to the lab, if it tests positive, it means there was 50 nanograms per milliliter or more in that test of the marijuana, which mainly the ingredient is THCA. Now, they immediately run a second test to make sure that first positive was correct. Its cutoff is 15 nanograms per milliliter. And if they report you, the MRO calls you and says, hey, you tested positive for marijuana, and you say, no, there's no way, he'll ask you, do you want to test your split sample? Well, if you say yes, that's what your B bottle was for. They send it to a new lab, and its cutoff value is even less because it's a more sensitive test. So, there's cutoff values for everything.
Okay, so that cutoff, is that, we're talking about marijuana or pot right now. Does that cutoff value, does that apply to all drugs too? Do each of them have two different cutoff values?
Oh, yes, because like I said, on your initial test, if it's positive, your cutoff, a good example, let's just move on down to cocaine, okay? If you test positive, that means it tested at 150 nanograms per milliliter or higher on the initial test. When they do the secondary test, if it's still positive, if it's 100 nanograms per milliliter or more. So every test has a cutoff value.
And you always do a split sample?
Always. You're going to have two bottles. That's why they tell you when you go in to provide 45 milliliters. The initial A sample is going to have 30 milliliters in it. The B bottle, the secondary sample, is going to have 15. The B bottle is frozen for at least a year to make sure that if you have to have it, you've got a way to send it to another lab.
And if you do have that secondary sample tested, it goes to a different lab than the first sample?
That's right. It may end up still being a Quest lab per se, or a LabCorp lab, or a CRL, any of those, but it is a different laboratory from the one that originally tested it to make sure there wasn't a fault with the test itself.
Okay, while we're talking about those split samples, and I know we talked a little bit about this in part 2 of this series.
Sure.
But I want to review that just for a second, because the driver has some responsibility when he goes in and gives his urine sample. There's a chain of custody, and that driver has some responsibility there, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, he's got to cover himself, because in the end, if he screws it up, it's his or not. Good example of that, you go in and you walk into the laboratory and you're here for your drug test. They give you the specimen cup. You fill out the chain of custody. You go provide your specimen and you come back, and the lab tech says, "Then you can go wash your hands and we'll finish this when you get back." You just lost control of that. What if there are 6 other vials sitting there? Who's to say that what they put in your bottles is yours? Could it be on purpose? Could it be accident? Absolutely. But once the seals are put on that and you initial it, it's yours whether it's yours or not. So never, never leave your sample unattended from the time you provide it until those bottles are sealed and you've initialed them, no matter what they tell you.
And there's no excuse for it to take a long time to get that seal on there because you fill out all the paperwork before you even go in to give the sample.
Oh, absolutely. Once they fill it into things, they're going to snap the bottle shut. Those seals are on the bottom of the chain of custody. They pull them off, stick them in the top, roll them down the side. You initial them, you're done.
Okay, we keep talking about split samples, and I have people ask me about that very thing. I went in and I peed in one cup. How did the split samples happen?
Well, okay, and first of all, let's start with the cup. It itself will hold over 45 milliliters, but there'll be a mark on it or something. Shows you what your minimum is. There will also be a sticky thing on the side of it to make sure it's within temperature range. That way they can check two things at one time. You've got enough, it's within temperature range. So
and that sticker has a color-sensitive thing on the side of it.
Oh, absolutely. It works with the temperature of the urine, and it says if it's this color to this color, it's between here and here. And as long as you're within temperature, then they'll walk over, and you've got two vials, probably about as big around as your thumb and probably about 4 inches long.
And some people call them test tubes.
Exactly right. They pop the tops on them. They pour 30 into one, 15 into the other, snap the lid shut. You watch them, stay with them the whole time they're doing this, and then they'll peel the seals off the bottom of the chain of custody, seal the bottle shut. That's when you initial it, and then the test is completed. You can walk off and leave it knowing that that's your stuff.
And if the nurse or the technician says, well, I'll get that later, we're kind of busy right now, you need to put your foot down and say, no.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not that maybe they're trying to fraud anything, but no, this has priority. This is your livelihood. This is your business.
And I hate to say it in this way, but sometimes you run into people who are just not very competent.
That's right. They have their different priorities than you have, where the only thing that's going to happen to them is maybe a slap on the hand if it's wrong. You've just put yourself out of being able to drive.
And every driver needs to understand it's your responsibility. Okay, before we get off the air, there's one thing I think we need to touch on, and that's how it's reported and actually what happens if you fail the test. Now, I know if you pass the test, if your results are negative, and that sounds funny, negative is passed, but if the results are negative, it really just kind of goes back in your employee file with your employer.
Oh, absolutely.
You just keep going.
Sure thing. There's no rule about it.
But if you fail a test, if you test positive, of course, the first thing that happens is the MRO calls to see if there is any prescription. And if there's not, it's a positive test result. How do they get that driver out of the truck? What happens?
Okay, basically what's going to happen if an MRO calls you and says, I need to know what kind of prescription medications you're on, and you give him the list, and there's nothing on there that would have tested positive for what he found, he will report the test as positive, and then depending on whether you're going through your company or whether you go through a consortium such as CMCI, if the consortium requested the test, we're going to get the result that says positive. We will immediately, this is the way our consortium works, we will immediately call the employer, and it will be his responsibility to remove that driver from doing anything considered a safety-sensitive function immediately.
But what about if I'm running under my own authority? I'm my own employer.
Well, you're still, once the consortium is informed on your failed drug test, we're going to call the designated employer representative, DER, and let them know, and it's their responsibility to take you off the truck because you can no longer perform a safety-sensitive function. Now, on alcohol tests is a little bit different. Alcohol tests are performed in the testing facility where you go to give your urine specimen to. If you fail, the testing facility is required to call directly to the designated employer representative and let them know, so now they can tell you that you can no longer drive. You must be removed from the truck.
So if you fail a test, whether it's drug or alcohol, it's the employer's job to get you out of that truck.
Exactly right. And you've always heard the old stories, well, I'll let him drive till he gets home, the truck gets back. What if he has an accident between there and there? Now you're the one that's going to be held liable because you let a known failed drug or alcohol test drive, which is totally against federal regs.
The employer would be
exactly
liable.
Right. The employer would be held.
A lot of people think the police are the ones that's going to get you out of the truck. But in matter of fact, in most states, the state isn't even notified that you failed.
Nope.
There are some states that do track that.
Oh, yeah, there's about 8 of them. And the funny thing is the reporting requirements for each state is different. So you almost have to check with your state and see. But the only ones right now that require reporting are Arkansas, California, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, South Carolina, Texas, and the state of Washington.
So if I'm driving out of the state of Missouri and I fail a drug test, I'm working for a motor carrier in Arkansas, and he pulls me out, the state of Missouri doesn't even know I failed that test.
The people in Arkansas may report it to Missouri, but Missouri's, so we got no way to document that.
Ideally, the DOT would like to have a national database that keeps track of all tests, whether you pass or you fail, to where everybody, every employer, every state would know what's going on. But that's just not reality right now, is it?
They keep talking about it, but it hasn't been implemented yet. And no, but the thing is an employer would protect you because it'd give you one place to go, and people couldn't hide these failed tests.
Okay, it looks like we're completely out of time. If you've got any questions or comments about this program, or if you'd like a certificate of completion for this program, just send us an email to businesseducation@ooida.com. And don't forget to tell us which program you're referring to. Also, please remember to give OOIDA's Drug Consortium, CMCI, the opportunity to earn your business the next time you're looking for a drug consortium. They can be reached on their direct line at 800-288-3784. You'll be glad you called. We hope you'll join us online again for additional programming in the OOIDA Business Education Series. This series has been designed to give serious business education to truck drivers who take their business seriously. And don't forget, OOIDA has been fighting for the rights of all truckers since 1973. You can join the fight by becoming a member of our organization. Give us a call at 800-444-5791.